We have the right to self-government, to self-determination of land. And the people that are here are going to go back and continue the struggle. This is not an end, it's only a beginning.
Hello, welcome to The True Canadians, the podcast, based on the book by the same title. I am your host, David Walenko. I wrote the book with Métis writer Patricia Russell. That opening segment that you heard is from a famous address given at the constitutional negotiations in 1987 by Sinclair, very well-known Métis leader and a very well-known moment in Métis history. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today with another very well-known Métis leader, Tony Belcourt. Welcome, Tony.
Hi, glad to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to talk a little bit about those negotiations at that time, which you would have some firsthand knowledge of. But we'd also like to talk about your career, which spans several decades, including up to and since you, I guess, tried to retire initially. But I think you're just as busy now, it sounds like, as ever. But some of our listeners may not know where it all began for you. And that's actually in Alberta, all the way back to your early times. You started out in Lac Ste, which is just northwest of Edmonton, and is a very historical and historic place for the Métis and for Indigenous peoples for the annual pilgrimage, which is in the summer. And my first question would be, could you have ever thought when you were growing up there that someday, decades later, the Pope himself would come to visit Lac Ste?
No, I never gave that kind of a thought when I was young. And when he did come, I was not at all pleased about the fact that he came there. When it was announced that he was going to come to Canada on St. Anne's Day to bring an apology to Indigenous peoples, I thought, well, the only place he can come is Lac Ste. And sure enough, it was announced that he was going to come there. I didn't have any understanding, really, of why I had such trepidations until the event took place itself. I know those grounds well. I played there as a kid when all we had were horse and buggy and tents and teepees, and we didn't have paved sidewalks or huge modern pavilions, which paved sidewalk thing sort of ruins the grounds, I believe. But anyway, when the Pope was at the lake and he was blessing our lake, which is called Spirit Lake, Manitoulin, I took offense at that. It's our lake. It's Great Spirit Lake. But it was when he turned around and left the podium, the arbor, and started walking back through the crowd, and there was this long phalanx of cardinals and bishops with their robes and their sashes and their hats, and that reminded me of when I was a child and how we were treated by the priest and by the bishops, especially during pilgrimage. In my day, pilgrimage was one day for Indians and Métis, or call us Aboriginal peoples then, and one day for French. Wednesday was for the Aboriginal people, Sunday was for the French. We had to be there, line up, kiss the ring of the bishop, and then be told we were heathens and savages, and talked down to. I remember that distinctly. When I became vice president of the Métis Association of Alberta, we weren't allowed to go on to French Day, I should mention. Our people came in from everywhere, as I mentioned, a horse and buggy, just on horseback, old trucks, old cars. This is in the 40s and early 50s, and our people had to clear the grounds on Thursday. They had to be gone. Everybody had to leave because they wanted to prepare the grounds for French Day. Well, I went out on French Day, and it was a stark difference of attitude by the bishop, who said, "Oh, you wonderful children of God." That really left a bad taste in my mouth. And I know many of our people are Catholic, and they follow that religious belief. And so they were no doubt very happy about the Pope coming. But not me, and many other people like me.
That is a very interesting perspective that we've not heard very much. Most people seem to want to be very positive about that visit. And then they only tell stories like that, generally in private. It's useful to hear it. And of course, from my perspective, it's not something I can appreciate or understand certainly what you went through, and probably very many people even who are Métis who are much younger. So it's very good for them to hear that as well.
There's other deeper undertones too, what was going on. And outsiders would not realize what was going on. That is a Métis community. It's our people that built that community. The nearby Alexander Reserve are people who came from another place. The Métis people are the ones that came to that church. It's my grandparents, great-grandparents that took care of the graveyards, our burial grounds that are there. That is a Métis community. But when the Pope was there and they had this big stage, it was filled with the First Nations leaders from down south in their full regalia. And we had 2 token Métis people on the stage. Our people at the local community level were not involved in the planning. They wouldn't be allowed. The bishops would not allow it. And that was a complete, such a disgraceful way to treat Métis people. And it kind of like the way we've always been treated, not only by the church, but, by the racism that exists, did exist in a big time when I was a child and in my teens and youth. But it still exists too today. Believe me, it exists.
On that note, Tony, what you make me really curious to know is your perspective on what the Pope said when he left. And I'm not sure why this happened in the airplane on the way back to Europe, but after he was in Quebec, he left and he spoke of the experiences at the residential schools and the burials that have been uncovered as a genocide, which is quite remarkable for us in Canada, where we like to think of ourselves as being such good people and, having a great legacy and a fantastic world reputation. I'm very curious now to get your thoughts on him saying that and how you feel about that.
Well, he's a very powerful person. I'm not saying he's a bad man, and he does good. And this is a kind of example of how he can do good things. He can speak out against atrocities, and he does. And so when he did that, he was doing absolutely a good service to our people.
Okay. Well, it makes me wonder with the kind of memories that you have and your opinions that you have voiced, it makes it kind of obvious how you would be someone who would want to go into the political side. But tell us a little bit about that history. Did you know from a very early age, I want to get involved politically because you had a role to play with the Métis Nation in Alberta, and then as a founder of the Métis Nation of Ontario?
No, I didn't have any notions whatsoever. Younger. In fact, I had left Alberta for a while to come down east, and when I went back, I was in my early 20s, and I just got involved in a natural kind of a way, just a sort of an organic kind of way. Your friends, you go to dances with, and all the rest of that. You're talking, inevitably, you're going to be talking politics, what's going on in the Métis Nation at the time. And I got involved in an organization called Team Products, which represented about 500 Métis and First Nations arts and crafts people. It was a cooperative of Alberta, people in Alberta and the Mackenzie Valley. And I got, from that platform, I got to see a lot of people, speak to a lot of people. And then I got involved locally. My family started a local in Edmonton, housing was the big issue. And my family carried on. My brother and my cousins built a wonderful organization called Canadian Housing. Our people in those years, in the late 60s and early 70s, not just Métis people, but First Nations as well, come into town and looking for work and better education, seeking a better way of life, but no houses to be found. There were houses that were available for rent and advertised in the Edmonton Journal. But when our people showed up and the smoky sounds of Creek came out of them, oh, sorry, it's been rented.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, that was the norm. That was reality. I experienced in Edmonton personally. I know of it, and I know of it happening across the Métis homeland. So you kind of get, you just naturally get into the whole business, and you have opinions and so on, and you think you can offer some support. So I ran. One of the things that interested me, well, everything at that time, all of the issues we were dealing with at that time, of course, interested me. You know, that people, no housing or inadequate housing, people living in shacks out in the bush, and no stove, just an oil drum, that often those things blew up and people died. Our people had health problems, and a lack of education, and therefore a lack of job opportunities. All those things were really, really important to us and of the priority. What really interested me was, how is it that we lost our land? Why did we lose our land? And I remember when I was a kid at pilgrimage, in the evenings when we would be crawling around listening to the people sitting around campfires talking, that's the kind of thing that people were talking about. What happened to our land? You know, we had people that went from here to Batoche, or people from Batoche were there, and they would talk about what happened and how we lost our land. How did we lose our land, and how are we going to get our land back? And my dad was really one of those people that was really in his craw.
Mm-hmm.
Got to get our land back. And when I looked into it, I saw that, you know, the treaty had been made in our area, and our people were called to the treaty, or went to the treaty rather, and were told that there was only going to be a treaty with the full-bloods, but there would be another one. Some commissioners come for the Métis, and there would be a treaty with them later. Well, that didn't happen. What we got was the government of Canada unilaterally deciding to create a half-breed commission and issue half-breed script that votes towards the extinguishment of Indian title. And so our people were called to these commission tents in 1885 after the Battle of Batoche, and were interviewed. We have a great record of who our ancestors are because of those interviews. And then they would be issued a scrip, which is a piece of paper that they could exchange for land or money. And inevitably, the land that was on the scrip would be hundreds of miles away from where people lived. So what use was that piece of paper? And also in 1885, by then the buffalo were gone. You know, our mainstay on the prairies of our economy. And people were hungry and starving, and the government offered these pieces of paper worth sometimes $260. Well, in 1885, that was a lot of money. But what did our people know? They didn't speak English. They didn't understand English. And beside the commissioners' tents, the government commissioners' tents, were the tents of the speculators, who were there to say, give me that piece of paper, I'll give you some money for it. Small amount of money. I mean, a lot to the people at that time, maybe $40, $50. You buy a lot of provisions for that, you'd be pretty happy. But they walk away with $260 worth of land or money script. There are people on the prairies who just got filthy rich over that scheme of swindling our lands away from us. And so when you take a look at that picture, you say to yourself, we're never going to get our land back if we don't establish a presence in Ottawa unless we go to the place that has the power. And it's not the provinces. They're not the ones that owe us the treaty. It's the federal government that does. So I harped away at Stan Daniels, who was the president at the time, to get the leaders of the other leaders together to talk about establishing a national office. And so we did. Stan did actually convince them to come to a meeting in British Columbia. That was the first annual meeting of the BC Association of Non-Status Indians. It was held in Victoria, and the president from Manitoba, Angus Spence, came to that meeting. And so did Jim Sinclair and Howard Adams from Saskatchewan, and Stan and I. And we did agree to form a small secretariat to see if we could get some money to hold a larger meeting and talk about creating an organization. And we did. We got a small grant from the Minister of Health to do a paper in response to the federal government's white paper on income security. So we used that money to have our founding meeting later the following year.
Well, that's an excellent place to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk with Tony about how you went from there to the Constitution Act of 1982 and the negotiations in the 1980s that we mentioned off the top, and all the way up to 92 when you were actually asked to draft a document in the House of Commons recognizing Louis Riel. We've been speaking with Tony Belcourt, and we'll be right back.
Hello, this is Audrey Patra. Today, we're hearing from Tony Belcourt. And I believe for most people in Alberta, we've heard about Tony Belcourt for a long time. Tony Belcourt is from Alberta, Lac Ste, Alberta. Tony was also very involved in politics in Alberta prior to moving to Ontario. He was the vice president of the Métis Association of Alberta and did some amazing work here prior to moving on to Ontario. At about the same time as the Métis National Council was being established, Tony became the first president of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And over Tony's time, he's done a lot of amazing work on behalf of the Métis. I sat at the Métis National Council with Tony from the day I got there until he retired in 2007. And during that time, Tony not only was president of Métis Nation of Ontario, but he had portfolios at Métis National Council where he did international work, where he became very involved at the United Nations. For the Métis Nation of Ontario, there was a lot of work, and Tony was there for many years to get the Métis Nation of Ontario up, running, having people involved, and definitely being part of our work at Métis National Council. It is still good to see Tony, during his retirement, still coming back to assist when needed, because I believe for someone like Tony, it will always be about the Métis Nation and about what else he can do.
So we're back with Tony Belcourt, and we've spoken about his origins at Lac Ste in Alberta and his political experiences over the 1970s, right up to realizing that real change was going to come from negotiating with Ottawa. So we'll ask Tony a little bit more about the formation of the Métis National Council and then the 1982 Constitution and the constitutional negotiations and from there. So Tony, it sounds like you were entering exciting times at that point, realizing that you needed to get to the seat of power, which is, of course, where the original conflicts came from back in the days of Johnny MacDonald and Louis Riel. So how did the Métis National Council finish getting formed, and what was its role and your aspirations for that organization?
Well, we didn't create the Métis National Council right off the bat. In February of 1971, when the leadership got together again, we decided to form the Native Council of Canada, brackets, Métis and non-status Indians. We decided to join forces with non-status Indians because we thought that we'd have a greater voice. And so non-status Indians were, in particular, groups like Indian Rights for Indian Women. They were wanting to get their status back because they had lost it because of the Indian Act. So we formed that organization on the strength of a excuse me, on the strength of a $10,000 loan from the Métis Association of Alberta. We opened up an office in Ottawa, and I moved to Ottawa. And in those days, you could walk freely throughout the House of Commons. There were security guards at the front door. You just waved at them, said hello, and you got to know them. And I also became a member of the National Press Club because I wanted to press the flesh, as it were, to get ourselves seen and known. In 1971, it was as if the Métis people had gone the way of the buffalo after the hanging of Louis Riel. Nobody knew we even existed in Ottawa. I mean, we had a presence on the prairies, but we sure didn't have a visibility, and not on anybody's radar in Ottawa, not the ministers, not members of parliament, not the press. You know, these guys at the press gallery, some of them with a strong Scottish brogue, asking, "What's a Métis?" You know, spitting it out at you. Everything was so derogatory. It was just so awful. But we managed to, within 3 years, while I was the president there, we managed to get core funding to build organizations all across the country. We certainly got a profile. We held sit-ins at Canada Mortgage and Housing at the president's boardroom, and walked out of there with $1 million for emergency repair money in December of 1972, and a promise to build 50,000 new homes in 5 years. We were very successful in establishing a presence. And then when my predecessor, Harry Daniels, came along, he pushed the envelope further. He wanted federal government to acknowledge that it had a jurisdictional responsibility to the Métis people. And so there was a lot of back and forth with the Minister of Justice at the time, who was Jean Chrétien, and we weren't getting anywhere on it. And along comes the constitutional talks. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau wanted to patriate the Constitution, to have Canada be on its own and not have to take its whatever it passes in the Parliament here over to Great Britain to get its approval. And he was having trouble, particularly from premiers in the West, and for their reasons, and also Quebec for its reason, because Quebec didn't want to be part of Canada, at least the leadership of Quebec at the time. So he was having a lot of trouble. He also needed the support of Aboriginal people, not so much the Métis, but certainly First Nations, because they had the treaties with the Crown. So he needed their support. So in order to get their support, he couldn't ignore the Métis and the Inuit either. Well, the Inuit, they have a special relationship because they had a special relationship brought by a Supreme Court of Canada case in the 30s, where Quebec took the federal government to court and said, you have the responsibility for the Inuit in northern Quebec, and that's how the Inuit became jurisdictionally a federal responsibility. But he couldn't just call First Nations to the constitutional talks about putting in an Aboriginal rights clause. He had to include our people. So Harry was there, very forceful. And when it was finally decided to add a clause to recognize the Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples, Harry insisted that there be a subclause saying the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are the Indians, the Inuit, and the Métis peoples. Harry knew full well if we weren't specifically named, in the Constitution, the federal government would simply take the position it had taken before, which was, we have jurisdictional responsibility for the Indians and the Inuit, but Métis, you go see the provinces. We don't have any responsibility for you. That was their position, and we knew that's what was going to happen after it was passed. And at one seminal meeting, they have these Senate hearings, joint sessions of the Senate and the House of Commons on the Constitution. The one dealing with the clause on Aboriginal rights was being held, and Chrétien was there, and Harry was saying, we need that clause. And Chrétien said, no, we're not. It's not necessary. Everybody knows who the Aboriginal peoples are, so we don't need that. Harry slammed his fist on the table and he said, well, then I mobilize my people. And he walked out of that hearing room. Everybody was in shock. And I'm sure the hallowed halls of the House of Commons, Parliament, the Prime Minister's office, and everywhere were saying, oh my God, not another rebellion. Chrétien left the room and came back and said, where's Harry? I have some news. Bring Harry Daniels back. So they got Harry and they brought him back. Jean Chrétien said, look, I've talked to the boss and we've agreed. We're going to add that subclause. And that's how Métis got into the Constitution.
No kidding. Isn't that something? What a story. Goodness gracious. That is really, really, really something. It reminds me a little bit of a story that's been circulating recently about Brian Mulroney and with the Acid Rain Treaty and talking to George Baker in the United States and saying, we need to get this done, saying, how on earth could the president of the United States, was Ronald Reagan, have a nuclear treaty with Russia, but not have an acid rain treaty with its closest trading partner and neighbor, Canada? And you remind me of that. And also because what you're talking about entered into those years from 1982, the negotiations through the 1980s. And I don't know, did Daniels hand off the responsibility to Sinclair? How did that come about? What were your thoughts on what was going on over those negotiations through the 1980s? Because some people have said we got the Constitution in 82, but then there was still a lot left yet to do.
Well, the Métis leaders of the prairies pulled out of the Native Council of Canada, and there's a long story. We don't have time to go into it, but they pulled out so that they could have a seat at the table. Those constitutional talks in the 80s were a requirement, an actual requirement of the Constitution, the prime ministers to invite the premiers and the leaders of the Aboriginal peoples to constitutional discussions to elaborate on what's in Section 35. What are those Aboriginal rights? And they invited the Native Council of Canada, but unfortunately, at that time, the leadership had shifted to president and vice president who were non-status Indians. So despite, the demands that the Métis people say, we want one of those two seats, they refused. Native Council of Canada refused. So the Métis pulled out. And that's why Jim Sinclair was sitting at the table and others. At the end of those constitutional talks, they ended in failure, as we know. The prime minister wanted to do something afterwards he was on our side. I have no doubt about that. So he created the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Let's get this discussion going nationally. Let's get a Royal Commission. And he appointed Métis and First Nations and Inuit people to that Royal Commission. Paul Chartrand was our representative. The Royal Commission made its report and nothing happened. We had the Charlottetown round of talks to really continue the work of developing Canada's Constitution and specifically towards bringing Quebec back in to Confederation, and also appeasing the prairies who wanted equal representation in the Senate. We had a sidebar discussion going between the Métis representatives from Ontario to British Columbia and the premiers from those provinces and the Prime Minister. And we got what was called a Métis Nation Accord. It was an amazing document that would recognize the Métis right to self-government. It would create a treaty. It would establish discussions on provision of lands to the Métis people. It's an incredible document. We should do a story just on that document alone. But Charlottetown failed, so therefore the Métis Nation Accord didn't go anywhere. So one other thing a couple other things that Brian Mulroney did for us was to ask Joe Clark, Deputy Prime Minister, to put a resolution forward to honor Louis Riel. And I had known Joe Clark, and he called me and asked me if I could provide the draft. I got hold of Paul Chartrand, and Paul actually held the pen on that. And Yvonne Dumont and I, we worked together, and we handed this over, and it went to the House of Commons. It was approved by all parties in the House. There should be a statue put up for Riel on Parliament Hill. I mean, if you're going to honor the man, honor him properly. The one other thing that he did, Brian Mulroney did for the Métis people, was to appoint Yvonne Dumont to be the first Métis Lieutenant Governor of the province of Manitoba. Yvonne had been our national leader, the Métis National Council leader, during those constitutional rounds and before that. He and Brian Mulroney struck up a good personal relationship. And so to further give us some due, he appointed Yvonne to be Lieutenant Governor.
I didn't know that. I knew John Norquay was the fifth premier of Manitoba and was of Métis descent. And so, and that was in the late 1800s, I believe. Right. But this period you're talking about, Tony, is a fascinating segment of history we don't hear a lot about, certainly in Canadian history books. But with the time we have left, I'm very curious to jump ahead and to find out how you feel about things today. You mentioned self-government. Well, ever since the 1982 Constitution and throughout the 90s and into this century, self-government has continued to be a reoccurring aspiration for the Métis, which is really about going back to the way things were 200 years ago, not creating something brand new. How do you feel about where things are at today? There's this legislation before Parliament. I asked you at the beginning if you thought the Pope would ever go to Lac Ste. Did you ever think there'd be legislation recognizing self-government? It's select provinces, but I mean, it seems pretty significant. I'm curious about your thoughts about that and then the progress since the 1990s to this juncture.
Well, I always believed you were going to get here. You got to have faith in what you're doing. And we had a great case to make. And when we participated in the debates of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I was Métis Nation ambassador, so I attended those talks. We were able to say a number of things obliquely to the federal government in our presentations, so that when this was passed, the Parliament, the government has decided to implement the provisions of the UN Declaration. Well, one of those is clearly, I mean, you've got to start with recognizing the right of self-determination of the peoples. And that includes implementation, facilitating the right of self-government. So the government is following in step with its commitment to implement the rights of the Declaration. It's falling in step with the provisions of the decision of Pauli, R versus Pauli, because one of that case, the Pauli case, was specifically about the right to hunt and fish for food. But what was determined was that the rights were not extinguished. The right to hunt and fish for food was not extinguished by the Robinson Treaties of 1850. And even though our people were there at the treaty-making process, and the chiefs supported our being part of the Robinson Treaties, and the chiefs understood that there was going to be a treaty subsequent with the Métis. That's why they signed on. Nothing happened. Our people were kept out. And so our rights were never extinguished. So that means all of our rights that belong to us as a people, the federal government has no choice but to follow through with us on that. Underlying everything is the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which is part of Canada's Constitution. I don't think people understand that. The Royal Proclamation provides that no British subjects may enter the territory of the Indigenous peoples without their consent, without an agreement with them. Well, they have no agreement with the Métis people. That is outstanding legal obligation. So it stands to reason that the federal government would now implement legislation to enable it to follow through, to enable the federal government to change its laws so that it can make direct transfer payments to our governments for the provision of programs and services, so that the federal government and provincial governments no longer have the control over things like child and family services. Right now, our organizations are more or less delivery agents for federal government programs and services. We have to deliver these programs and services on the terms and conditions and the policies that they've established. Well, we want to establish our own policies. And so the federal government has to change its laws so that it can transfer the money for us to be able to do that. And we can take care of our own people our own way.
Does that make the governments in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario, does that make these governments like a provincial government? Does it make them like a municipal government? Like, for a non-Métis audience, what's the consequence of this? What does it look like on the other side?
Well, it's no different than what's going on with First Nations. First Nations have governments. They control their own land. They make their own laws for who's going to be able to live on the properties and where the property is going to be. They make their own laws as to who's going to, how the funds that they acquire for housing are going to be distributed. First Nations governments already exist. So the model is no different. It's not like a municipal government. It's bigger than a municipal government. More powers involved. Now, the one thing is still the final step we've got to get to is our land. That's not on the agenda at the moment, but it has to happen. And the bill C-53 is also is going to enable the government to enter into a treaty with the Métis people. Well, when we get to treaty talks, there's no question land has got to be on the agenda.
Right. Well, Tony, there's a facet we haven't touched on, which I'd like to end with, which is, over the great span of your career, we talked about this notion of you having perhaps attempted to retire some years ago, but you've had so many great accomplishments even since then, and so much recognition. Is there anything as we wrap up here that for you really stands out, that you're particularly proud of, that you'd like people to know about or to hear about, or is there something about your aspirations for the Métis going forward that you'd like to touch on as we wrap up?
Well, I think that one of the big challenges that we have as Métis people is to establish or rekindle or reestablish good relations with our ancestral cousins. Our mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers going back in time are the same as First Nations. It's from the same families. We carry the same blood. We have kinship ties. We share cultural ties, language. We share the same languages and so on. But yet there's a big divide right now between First Nations and Métis people. And I think that in many ways is being driven by governments, divide and conquer. There's a lot of new development going on in our territories, resource development that's going on. And because of a Supreme Court decision that there is a duty to consult and accommodate, those companies have to not only consult with First Nations, they've got to consult with our people too. And that's being seen as a threat by First Nations. And our self-government recognition is also seen as a threat to the flow of money. And that issue existed 50 years ago when I first came to Ottawa. When I came here, I wanted to meet with the national chief at the time, George Manuel, Took a long time for me to get to meet with him. And when I did, George said, "Nobody wants me to meet with you, Tony. The chiefs don't want me to meet with you. Government doesn't want me to meet with you because they're saying, George, there's only a loaf of bread here. And if the Métis get recognized, some of that's going to have to go to them." And I said, "George, Ottawa is not a loaf of bread. Ottawa is a bakery. There are other departments out there we should be dealing with, not just Indian and Northern Affairs. We don't have any interest in dealing with Indian Affairs. You have scant little from them to begin with for education, housing, and so on. But let's get together and go to other places. Let's go to the Department of Health. Let's go to the Ministry of Housing. Let's go to the Department of Regional and Economic Expansion and Economic Development and so on. Let's go to there. Get a share of what's going to everybody else in Canada but us." And that worked for a time, but now I fear that a lot of people have forgotten the way George and I used to work, and other leaders. When I was president of the Métis Nation of Ontario, we had protocols, we had a nation-to-nation relationship, we worked together, and we're very successful in getting governments to follow our lead. But now there's this thought out there that Métis getting recognized, well, what's that going to do to their funding? It's the same question that existed 50 years ago. And so I'm very keen on trying to do whatever I can in an organic and traditional way with First Nations. And I'm talking to a lot of their elders and hoping that I can do what I can to bring leadership together, to talk, sit at a table and work these things out, smoke our pipes, sing our songs, dance and feast. These are the things we need to do.
That is fantastic. Well, Tony, we've covered a huge span of territory and time, all the way from 1763 to 2024. And well, you certainly are the person to talk to about all of that. Thank you so much for your time. We've been speaking with Tony Belcourt. Thank you for listening to this episode of The True Canadians. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.